Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Let us first acknowledge our presence here today on the traditional lands of Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq Nation. I'm Chris Stover, the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, and I'm so very pleased to be able to present to you tonight this final installment of the Seven Deadly Sins, Pride, the blind spots created by Canadian national pride. It's been quite a privilege to work on and bring this series to all of you, a series which explores the personal and collective consequences of our thoughts and actions as we continue to grapple with these age-old temptations of lust, greed, gluttony, envy, wrath, sloth, and finally tonight, pride. We've learned so much as we've worked through these themes about where we are on the pendulum in considering these so-called sins. What behaviors in these areas are no longer considered sinful today, and why not? And what aspects of behavior do we still maintain are wrong, and why do we hold strong to those particular values and maybe not to others? These questions, and many, many others like them, fuel the existence of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs. It's a non-advocacy organization co-founded in 2002 by the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University, with a mandate to bring the dialogue about ethics into our everyday lives. So I've had the unique pleasure, and actually so much fun, creating this series for you with my co-conspirator, Jessie Hiltz, who is SESEPA's program coordinator. Together, we've spent countless hours researching, discussing, and frankly, arguing, but in the best possible way, about how to best present these themes in a way that's both compelling and interesting for you, and also genuine to why the center exists, which in a nutshell is to have all of us thinking more clearly about how we are living and examining the right and wrong ways in which we respond to life, because we believe how we live matters very much. So I'd like to thank you all for being here and for perhaps following the entire series and for providing your feedback on the evaluations that you always find on your chairs. Because you listening to these discussions that we're creating, I believe, creates positive change in the world. So I'm now going to turn things over to the president of St. Mary's University and also SESEPA board member, Dr. Robert Summerby Murray, who is going to formally introduce our guest speaker tonight.
Thank you, Chris, and again, welcome to everybody here. Benvenuti tous Pigilasi. In Dante's second book of the Divine Comedy, pride is one of the most serious sins. Located at the base of Mount Purgatory, the proud atone for their sins by carrying heavy stones on their back. While they held their heads up too high in the past, now their heavy burdens make them bend down low, facing the ground in humility. In the context of Canadian history and Canadian pride, we might see ourselves in Dante's description of the proud. It's my great honor this evening to introduce to you our guest speaker, Leonard G. Flat, not only because of his contribution to this series, but because of the timely relevancy of the examination of what it means to be proud in Canada. Recent events, perhaps even some events from Charlevoix, Quebec, have shown us we have good reason at times to hold tight to our chests that notion of a uniquely Canadian pride. But coexisting on the darker side are many things which limit our ability to stand as tall as we might wish. Tonight's presentation, so generously supported by the Segelberg Trust, the Halifax Central Library, and the Nova Scotia Office of Aboriginal Affairs, will examine the impact of colonialism, the historical shortfalls of government and educational institutions, but also the recent positive developments that may give rise to a new kind of national pride in this country. Leonard Flat is a Cree, member of the Big Trout Lake, Ontario First Nation. Originally from Cumberland House, Saskatchewan, and Shamattawa, Manitoba, he worked with the Hudsons Bay Company and the Northwest Company for 42 years, retiring as Vice President in 2005. He has received the National Aboriginal Achievement Award and is also an inductee into the Order of Manitoba and the Order of Canada. He is a recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal. Len is the author of From the Barren Lands, which tells the story of the fur trade, First Nations, and the development of northern Canada, told from the perspective of his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. There will be copies of Len's book available for purchase after the presentation, and if you look carefully on the front cover of the book and on a slide that you saw a few minutes ago, you might just catch a glimpse, a photo of an only slightly younger Len Flat. Please join me now in extending a very warm Halifax welcome to our guest, Leonard Flat.
Thank you, Rob, for the kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, representatives of the Mi'kmaq Nation who are here this evening in support, thank you for being here. And like Rob said, I do have some books that are available for sale after my talk. And just a quick note is that, and you saw it in the picture on the cover of my book, I was raised on caribou meat. I was dressed in caribou clothes, and somehow I managed to attain a high school education and retire as a vice president of a billion-dollar corporation. So I think that you'll find my stories this evening interesting. I want to thank Chris Stover and the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs for the invitation to speak. I understand that this event is the last of a series of presentations on the theme of the 7 deadly sins. And I hope I can do justice to my topic, pride and the blind spots created by pride. As is our custom at events such as this, I would like to acknowledge also that we are on Mi'kmaq traditional territory. And this is always a friendly reminder about the origins of our country, that the First Nations originally occupied these lands, and that they welcomed, assisted, and taught the first settlers how to survive the rigors of our Canadian winters, and also how to treat the ravages of scurvy from which so many of the original immigrants suffered. My English name is Leonard Flat. My Indigenous spirit name is Manitou Makwa, which means spirit bear. It is the name by which we identify ourselves to the Great Spirit in spiritual ceremonies. I am from Winnipeg, Manitoba. Winnipeg in my Cree language means dirty water. And Manitoba in Cree means where the Great Spirit sits. Also in 1535, Indigenous people greeted Jacques Cartier to an area close to present-day Quebec City and welcomed him to Kanata. And the point I want to make here is that sometimes we tend to forget, overlook, or just take for granted the legacy left by our Indigenous people, which is so evident all around us. Before I get too far into my presentation, I want to let you know that I have IPF. It's idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. It means I have fibers growing in my lungs, and the infected areas have become dry and leather-like. I become short of breath with any physical activity or when I speak for an extended length of time. But I am not in any pain. So don't worry. Don't worry if during the course of my talk I take some extra time or struggle to catch my breath. I am a Treaty First Nation of the Kitchener-Nunavuk, or in English, Big Trout Lake, Ontario. In 1929, my grandfather, Chief Samson Beardy, became acutely aware of prospectors overrunning his territory shortly after gold had been discovered nearby. He wanted security for his people, and he wanted security for his land, and he thought that a treaty with Canada would be the best vehicle to provide this. That same year, my grandfather signed the adhesion to Treaty Number 9 in Northern Ontario, committing his people and their territories to Canada. I want you to think about that for a minute. The treaty making that I'm talking about is not ancient history, as many people seem to think. I had the privilege and pleasure of knowing my grandfather. I was a child when I first met him, and I was a young man when he died. My great-grandfather was named Wasakanuchi. That's it, just one name, as was customary back then. In our language, it means one who comes from far away. And I can go back another generation. My great-great-grandfather was Paquetna, which means big hill or mountain. I come from a family of big people. I am the eldest of 14. I have 9 brothers, and all 9 brothers are well over 6 feet tall. I'm 5'10". When my brothers are kind, they call me their little brother. And when they get cheeky, they call me the runt of the family. Our family's oral history tells us that Paquetna had 2 wives at the same time. And I'm not quite sure what to think about that. I guess it was a good thing. Good for Grandpa. Samson Beardy's obituary in the Keewatin newspaper of Northern Ontario states that he was an exemplary leader, a large, powerful man of integrity and wisdom, and that he was the last of a long line of hereditary chiefs. Wasakanuchi and Paquetna, therefore, were also chiefs of their people. Today, I am tremendously proud of my Indigenous family and heritage. But sadly, that was not always the case. And I will explain why later in this talk. I want to address the state of our Indigenous communities. And as I think about this, I am reminded about comedians opening with, I have good news and I have bad news. I have to start with the bad news. It is sometimes necessary to pick at the scabs of history to encourage healing. First of all, there are a few points of history that I want to explain from my own perspective. And then I want to tell you about my own personal unpleasant experiences that may explain, or at least give you a broader understanding of why I may feel ambivalent about displaying national pride on or at Canada Day celebrations. It may also give you pause to reflect on your own national pride while Indigenous people continue to occupy the lowest strata of our economic and social scales, especially in a democratic society as wealthy and advanced as Canada's. Because I am from the West, my comments will be limited to the reserves of Northern Ontario and Western Canada. I did an internet search of the reserves in Nova Scotia and found that most are doing fairly well and so much better than the remote reserves that I will be focusing on this evening. The Confederation of Canada in 1867 was a pivotal point in our history. Leading up to that date, our people had been devastated by the new diseases carried by the Europeans who had developed immunity to, but from which our people had none. Smallpox, measles, influenza, scarlet fever, whooping cough, typhus, cholera, just to name a few. Unlike Europeans, the Indigenous people of the Americas did not have or keep any large domestic animals like cows, sheep, goats, or pigs that often incubate and pass on various types of infections. By any means, by 1867, Canada was dealing with a First Nations population that was just a fraction of its former self. Many treaties between the settlers and the First Nations had been entered into over the centuries, and it was these treaties that made the gradual colonization of this country possible. In 1871, when our fledgling country looked westward for expansion, John A. Macdonald missed an opportunity to found our country on the basis of sharing with the First Nations. Instead, he took advantage of the vulnerability of the Indigenous people who were dealing not only with diseases, but who were now also faced with the real possibility of starvation with the disappearance of the buffalo. What the First Nations, later including my own grandfather, desired in entering into treaties with Canada was a measure of dignity and, more importantly, security. Security from disease, security from hunger, and security from becoming extinct. Macdonald instead structured one-sided treaties as a means of stripping the people from their lands. Today, reserves make up less than 1% of Canada's land mass, 0.63 of 1% to be exact. Shamefully, MacDonald also instituted a policy of famine to force the last few resisting First Nations into the treaties through threats of starvation. The First Nations were then relegated to tiny reserves for the next 100 years and were subjugated by the draconian provisions of the Indian Act. It included being prohibited from leaving their reserves. Neither were they permitted to meet in groups, nor were they allowed to raise funds for the purpose of hiring legal counsel. There were many restrictive clauses or provisions in the Indian Act, but I mention these three provisions specifically because the implication is that the First Nations were viewed as enemies of the state, and as such were confined to their reserves for the next 100 years. I need you to understand that this mistreatment of confinement, which was a part of the early policies of John A. Macdonald, did irreparable, crippling harm to the spirit and to the psyche of the First Nations people, especially those on remote reserves. Think about it. Several generations of First Nations people confined to their reserves, fed by government rations, knew nothing about life outside of their reserves. Enough history. At 7 years of age, I had to leave home, which was in the far north, to attend school in the south, where I was the only Cree speaker. The government was not yet building schools in remote areas. They were still focused on the residential schools. When my parents dropped me off for school, I did not see any members of my family for the next 3 years. I remember my mother weeping, not only with joy after they were finally able to visit me, but also with sorrow because I could no longer communicate with her. She spoke only Cree, and after 3 years, I was no longer able to converse in either of the two Indigenous languages, Cree and Dene, that I had been equipped with when I left home. My father had to interpret for us. And even though I was only 10 years old, I felt very much like a stranger. My mother was illiterate at the time. Even though it was against the law, my grandfather Sampson removed my mother from residential school because he had heard rumors of abuse. With tutoring from my father, my mother had to learn not only to speak English, but also to read and write the language so that she could continue to communicate with her children as they also had to leave home for school. I was the eldest of 14 children. The government finally started building schools locally on reserves in the early 60s, making it possible for the younger half of my siblings to attend school at home. And today, their mother tongue is Cree, and English is their second language. I and the older half of my siblings are English speaking, and to this day, we still feel the loss of a good part of, if not most, of our mother tongue and culture. Growing up and going to school in a period of political incorrectness, I was made to feel ashamed of being Indigenous. And it was impossible for me to hide behind my color. My early years as a youth and as a young man were spent in a constant struggle to rebuild my self-esteem. For you to understand the deep scars caused by the residential schools that we carry within our souls, I want to read a passage from the book Indian Horse, written by the late Richard Wagamis, who states it best. He wrote, "We lived under constant threat. If it wasn't the direct physical threat of beatings, it was the dire threat of purgatory, hell, and the everlasting agony that their religion promised for the unclean, the heathen, the unsaved. When your innocence is stripped from you, when your people are denigrated, and when the family you came from is denounced, and your tribal ways and rituals are pronounced backward, primitive, savage, you come to see yourself as less than human. That is hell on earth, that sense of unworthiness. That's what they inflicted on us. Those are powerful words, stated with hurt emotion. The residential school system succeeded in dehumanizing the First Nation children and robbed them of their sense of self-worth. On top of all that, without the daily guidance and love of our parents, I and my siblings, like so many other residential school survivors, just stumbled along and learned to cope with life on our own, mostly on a trial and error basis. Some succeeded, many more just fell on the wayside. I have one more unpleasant experience to share with you. I started school in 1949, far from home. And finally, after 7 years, my father was able to bring us home for a visit to our home community of Little Duck Lake in the territory of the Saisi-Deni, which is in the Barren Lands of northernmost Manitoba. It was in the summer of 1956 that government representatives arrived in the community. They initiated meetings in what turned out to be an effort to deliberately misinform the people for the sole purpose of relocating them to Churchill, a port town on Hudsons Bay. People had been complaining that the Saisi-Deni were killing the caribou herds of the area indiscriminately. The government of the time made the decision to simply relocate the people from their traditional lands to resolve the complaints. The accusations of excessive killings of the caribou in the end turned out to be just false presumptions. Nevertheless, the people who had been promised houses, jobs, and better lives in Churchill were lied to by incompetent officials of that time who had no compunctions about treating these people like animals. Here's why. When the people arrived in Churchill in late August, they were taken to their site several miles out of town on the shore of Hudsons Bay. There, they found nothing. No houses, no jobs, just a pile of lumber on a desolate, rocky shoreline. The Saisi-Deni ended up having to fend for themselves with little or no shelter the first year, and nothing much better in the following years. A friend of mine related how she survived as a child by foraging in the garbage behind the local Hudsons Bay Company store in town. Approximately half of the small population of a little over 100 died. Died from sickness, alcoholism, violence, and exposure. Before they took matters into their own hands, after about 20 years of languishing in exile, they relocated themselves back to their traditional territories in defiance of the authorities. Some of those people who died needlessly were my childhood friends. My childhood friends. Again, think about that for a minute. And think about how far Canada, and especially its government officials, have come in its attitude toward and treatment of Indigenous people in just my own lifetime. It is truly, truly an incredible thought. In later years, as I moved on with my own career, with first the Hudsons Bay Company and then the Northwest Company, I had the opportunity to visit and to live on several reserves. I enjoyed the experience because of the people I met and the many friends I made. These people, once independent, managed to lead sustainable lives of hunting, trapping, fishing, and gathering by spreading themselves out over a wide area of their lands. That's how they were able to make sustainable lives for themselves. The problem began with the governments establishing and building up the reserves in remote areas, constructing homes, schools, band offices, and so forth. It all sounds well and good. But the underlying problem with those reserves is that they were not established to serve any economic means, such as becoming service centers for mining or transportation or manufacturing of some type, which are usually the necessary underpinnings for sustainable communities. Instead, the policy appeared to be one of removing a people from their traditional lands for the purpose of clearing an unimpeded path for mining, logging, and hydro development projects. Many years later, the end results, in too many cases, are overcrowded, unsustainable communities with crumbling infrastructure and almost total unemployment. Jobs are almost non-existent, except for those involved in community administration, teaching, and possibly working in healthcare. The people have become too dependent upon government programs. The communities are rife with social issues. Not enough meaningful attention is given to the issues of our remote reserves by policymakers. This stain on Canada's mosaic is mostly out of sight, out of mind, like dirt swept under a carpet. The Auditor General of Canada's latest report, released just 2 weeks ago, expressed concern that Indigenous programs were not more effective. A telling remark was that there was a conspicuous lack of meaningful engagement with the Indigenous communities. Very simply, it would appear that training programs and the occasional temporary employment without proper long-term engagement does not fulfill the basic human needs for security, dignity, and self-worth. Everyone, including our people, need the opportunity to rise and benefit by one's own meaningful labor, not make work projects. Despair not. As dire as some of the situations appear, there are many positive indications that we as a nation are turning a crucial corner. In fact, we have made a lot of progress that we can all be proud about. And first of all, I want to go back a few years and commend our Prime Minister of that time, Mr. B. Pearson, for choosing the maple leaf to represent our flag. I am proud of this flag. There's no St. George's Cross or fleur-de-lis to remind us of our colonial beginnings. Then what followed is what I think to be the most important development, not only for the First Nations, but also for the entire country. And that was the Constitution Act of 1982 with its embedded Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In fact, the Act has been instrumental in shaping and defining our country as a multicultural mosaic being built by the efforts of many nations, including our Indigenous people. Section 35 of the Constitution Act reads, "The existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples are hereby recognized and affirmed." Ladies and gentlemen, this was the turning point for our people. The Act does not spell out or identify our rights. Instead, it left a process by which our legal system, and especially our Supreme Court, could define those rights. The process has been long, tedious, costly, but case after case has been ruled by the Supreme Court in favor of First Nations, and the process is still ongoing. Lawsuits by Indigenous organizations have exposed chronic underfunding in Indigenous education, Indigenous health, and Indigenous child welfare. And governments have taken the necessary steps to begin correcting those wrongs. Stepping back a few years again, the James Bay and Northern Quebec Cree Act of 1975 was the first of what we call the modern treaties. It set out the shared benefits of hydroelectrical developments in Northern Quebec for the Inuit and the First Nations. And this very successful agreement has become the model for similar large projects. Along the same lines, in 1997, a major ruling by the Supreme Court in a province that had no treaties whatever with its Indigenous people recognized and affirmed that the First Nations in British Columbia did indeed have Aboriginal rights and interests in their traditional lands. And following that ruling, in 1999, a self-government agreement was enacted between British Columbia and the Nisga'a First Nations. The Assembly of First Nations in Ottawa has long advocated for self-government, stating that it was high time for the Indigenous people to step out from under the shadows of the federal government. The Nisga'a Agreement gave that nation total control and governance over 2,000 square kilometers of its traditional territory in the northern part of that province. Other agreements soon followed, and many more are under negotiation. With the new government elected in 2015, Jody Wilson-Raybould is the first Indigenous person to be appointed to the important portfolio of Federal Minister of Justice and Attorney General. And she joins the record number of 12 Indigenous members of Parliament and 8 Indigenous senators, all having positive impacts on our governance. In the area of education, I have been involved with Inspire for about 28 years, serving twice as its chairperson. Inspire is a nonprofit charitable organization founded in 1985 to raise funding from the public and private sectors for distribution through bursaries and scholarships to Indigenous students. Since inception, now somewhere around 30 years, the organization is now approaching $100 million in bursaries and scholarships, raised and distributed to around 30,000 Indigenous students nationwide. Let me put this into perspective. When I graduated from high school in 1960, there were only 2 of us in the entire school who were Indigenous. And this was in the city of Prince Albert. And that same year, there were only something like 60 Indigenous students enrolled in post-secondary programs across the entire country. There was a reason for that. In 1951, the first major changes to the Indian Act were made after almost 80 years of repressive neglect. It eliminated or revised the most restrictive clauses in the Act, including the provision that forbade the people from leaving their reserves. The First Nation people also received the right to vote, but only in 1960. Conditions were improving, but even so, in 1960, Dan Sasakamoose and I were the only First Nation graduating students in our 2 high schools in Prince Albert. In fact, there were very few Indigenous people in the city. There were no Indigenous organizations, no resources, no Indigenous businesses, nothing. Even without that restrictive clause in the Indian Act, it would be another decade before our people felt confident enough to leave their reserves in search of better lives and begin the migration into cities that continues to this day. Today, approximately 50% of First Nations live off reserve. Today, Prince Albert, a city located centrally to a number of reserves, has a population of 35,000, of which 40% are Indigenous. Today, it is also a thriving city with numerous Indigenous businesses and organizations, including 4 urban reserves. Today, Indigenous people are filling the ranks of doctors, nurses, lawyers, architects, engineers, teachers, and many other professions. Today, Indigenous businesses across the nation are represented in almost all sectors, including technology, engineering, construction, manufacturing, transportation, and so forth and so forth. I'm running out of oxygen. Earlier in my talk, I expressed my concerns with many of our remote reserves. It is too late now to think about dismantling them or relocating them, because for many of our people, they have come to represent our homelands. I have an emotional attachment to my home reserve, in spite of its many issues, and I travel home whenever I can to visit family and friends. The lack of an economic base for these reserves can be partially offset by guaranteeing these communities share in any developments that take place on their traditional territories. For example, a gold mine that was recently opened in northern BC is sharing its economic benefits with the Nisga'a First Nation, with whom it has an agreement. Remote reserves can also be assisted by the development of urban reserves. Urban reserves are recent developments, with the first one developed in Saskatchewan in the early 1980s. An urban reserve is defined as a reserve within or adjacent to an urban center. Most urban reserves are a result of lands purchased by First Nations that are then converted to reserve status if the First Nation qualified for such under an outstanding land entitlement. The urban reserves have become economic satellites that provide an income stream for our reserves. And they provide employment opportunities for many of our people. Under an agreement with Canada, First Nations who have outstanding land claims have the right of first refusal of any surplus federal lands that become available. When the Canadian Armed Forces relocated from Winnipeg to Brandon in 2004, 150 acres of prime property within the city limits became available. A consortium of 7 First Nations made a bid on this site. The government resisted the bid because Winnipeg residents around the area banded together to fight a, not in my backyard, development of a reserve. They feared an urban ghetto, and they feared that their own properties would drop in value. The ensuing legal battles and appeals initiated by the government at the time ended up in the Supreme Court 3 times, with the court coming down in favor of the First Nations each time. Finally, last month, the present government simply announced the transfer of the land to the First Nations, with negotiations underway to ensure that a world-class development would take place. The residents have now come to understand and appreciate the immense potential for the project and are now welcoming the development of the property, which has lain vacant and deteriorating for the past 14 years, the time it took for the legal battles to be settled. This is a major turnaround in attitudes toward urban reserves. There were 134 urban reserves on record as of 2008. I couldn't find any more information. Somebody's keeping it a secret. But my guess is that that number would now be approaching 200 or more. Many are small, supporting just a gas station and a convenience store. Others are larger, ranging in size to support hotels, casinos, educational centers, business complexes. Now, before you get the wrong idea, our people still occupy the lower rungs of the Canadian economic ladder. And we are still plagued by the many issues that come with poverty. However, for the reasons that I talked about, I cannot help but feel that we are on the verge of entering a new era of Canadian history. The new era will be one of inclusion and respect, one that would make me proud to stand alongside my fellow Canadians on July the 1st and acknowledge with pride that indeed we have come a long way together. A few weeks ago, our members of Parliament stood up and voted overwhelmingly, 269 to 10, in support of a bill to invite Pope Francis to Canada so that he can apologize in person on behalf of his church for their role in the Indian residential school system. This is reconciliation in action, whether or not the apology actually happens or not. A further demonstration of reconciliation, showing the mutual respect that we are striving for, was exhibited recently by this city. Yes, Halifax has taken the lead in showing sensitivity to our people and our history by the removal of the statue of Edward Cornwallis from its downtown park. And I understand a high school has also removed his name. I think I can safely say that I speak on behalf of all of our people when I say that you have my personal gratitude, my respect, and my admiration for your city and its people. Similar considerations are also being contemplated for John A. Macdonald in certain areas of Western Canada, as we continue to define and separate commemoration from preservation of history. So two separate subjects. On a personal note, I mentioned earlier that I had IPF, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. I was diagnosed in 2013, and at that time there was no cure or medication to combat this deadly disease. And a lung transplant was out of the question because of my age. The average lifespan from date of diagnosis was only 3 years. My wife Marguerite and I left the doctor's office in shock. And we just sat in our car in the parking lot and wept. Fortunately, a year later, in 2014, breakthrough medications were developed. My affliction has been in remission since. I am not cured, but the disease at this point is not progressing. I still have use of about 2/3 of my lungs. This evening, I feel privileged and grateful to stand before you and be able to give this address. I love our country. I love our flag. Together we have come a long way. Together we have a lot to be proud about. I love your city, and I love you. Thank you for coming out to listen.
Hard act to follow. Thank you so much, first of all, to Len for speaking. And while he gathers his breath, I would invite anybody with a question or a comment to please come to the microphone. And if anybody is in our online audience with a question, you can post those on our various social medias. So take your time. Here's the mic. And yes, we await your questions. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I guess what I've always been interested in is the Indian Act. And what is preventing the reformation of the Indian Act, or the abolition of the Indian Act? Or what's preventing this from happening? in your view?
I often thought about that myself, and what it is that one of the reasons why we entered into treaties with it. I talked about the disease and hunger, but also we wanted security from extinction. We did not want to become extinct, and perversely, the Indian Act was the only statute that we had in the Canadian government that recognized that we even existed at all. And so many of our people live masochist, well, I forget the word now, but we live under the Indian Act in spite of its many evils, because it was all that we had to recognize us until the Constitution Act of 1982.
A question from online, just wondering whether you see a difference in something like an idea of pride in the usual kind of Canada 150 cents and the kind of pride that maybe we should be working towards. How do those things seem or feel different to you?
The pride that I'm talking about, for the future is one of inclusion and respect. People think that we're looking for special status, and we're not. But what we really want is some dignity and respect and some understanding of who we are as a people. And so that's how I would define pride in the future, and that would be one of inclusion and respect for all of us.
Well, I came to the Northwest Company, as you well know, worked for them for 30 years. And my background before that, I was a history major. And I spent the next 30 years in the North unlearning history because my interpretation of everything was based on this colonial way of looking at things, that Christopher Columbus had come here in 1492 and discovered America. Well, as you well know, the Aboriginal people had been here 12 to 15,000 years earlier than that, and North America did not need discovering, thank you very much. So it's like you have to deconstruct what you've learned and then learn again. And the Aboriginal peoples that I worked with over the years, the Cree First Nation, my wife's Dene, and I worked for many years among the Dene. They were very gracious to me in understanding that this guy at the university who doesn't know anything, really, learning all over again. How do you think that we can change the educational system? I know in your book, the epilogue of your book, you talk about how do we solve the problems between government, because it's really a multi-layered thing. It's government, it's the church, it was us, even the Hudsons Bay Company, the Northwest Company. There was another level of systems that didn't really jive or work well for Aboriginal peoples. How do we rejig the education system to teach people? Because when I started learning about the history of Halifax, for example, it started in 1749. And I'm sure that these gentlemen here that represent the meeting now could tell you there's an awful lot more history than involved in that. How do we, start relearning the relationship between our peoples?
That's great. That's a great question. Let me tell you a little story. I think it was 2 weeks ago. in Winnipeg, I went to a powwow. It was a graduating powwow, and Winnipeg is a major city, and probably on a per capita basis, it has one of the larger populations of Indigenous people, and most of them are concentrated in the older part of the city, which is the north end. And so when I like attending ceremonies and powwows and so forth. And when I saw a notice of this powwow in the north end a couple of weeks ago, I went to it. And what it was all the schools in that area, and all the Aboriginal children from those schools met in this community center, and they were having a powwow. They're dancing and celebrating their accomplishments in our school system, and they had a right to be proud of themselves, of course. And just a few days after that, I was invited to a dance recital for one of my friend's grandchild, and so I went to that. Went to the one of the major theaters in Winnipeg, and saw this dance recital. And what struck me, and it was huge. There was the theater was sold out. It was on a Sunday, and many parents and grandparents and friends of the family were there celebrating their children's participation in these dance projects. And it struck me how separated that we really are. In that, I was at this dance recital, which was very, very white. Pardon my expression, but it was very establishment. And there were a few black people, and there were a few Asians, but not one Indigenous child in those hundreds of children that were involved. And then I see this powwow with hundreds of Indigenous children celebrating their accomplishments. And out of that, two things came to mind for me. Number one, culture is very important to our young people. They need to rebuild themselves, because the residential schools, the early policies, had been to kill the Indian in the child. And so our children are just trying to rebuild themselves. And I realized then that we probably are not ready for full integration. Not integration, that's the wrong word. We are integrating right now, with the mass migration into the cities over all these years. It's happening now. We are integrating. But what is very evident is that we are not assimilating. And again, it comes down to the need for survival, I guess, as a nation, as Indian people. And so what I envision in the future is that, at least in the near future, maybe it'll change further down the years, but in the next little while, what I foresee is that we will be two nations, white and Indigenous, standing together, celebrating Canada Day, and we can do that, even though we are separate for now and maybe for some time until our until we become healed, until all the hurt has been erased from our living memories.
Thank you for sharing. I have two questions, and I'm wondering what your reflections are on that. One is the fact that there are more Native kids in child protection today now than in the height of residential school. And what does that truly say about this country's commitment to reconciliation? And tied into that is, I'm not sure if you're aware that in Atlantic Canada, there are very few resources provided to assist for the taking care of kids within the communities. But there's a lot of money if they're taken out to white community. So this whole process of killing the Indian within the child, it still seems to be Canada's active policy, despite what it says on paper. And lastly, kind of tied into that, is we have this claim from the colonial government of Canada that there are no funds, insufficient funds. They make all kinds of excuses for not being able to provide adequate water and other things that are needed in some of our communities. But yet in the middle of Afghanistan, where there was a war zone in the desert, they made sure there was water provided to people who were going to kill other people. So what makes us wonder about the real commitment to that. And lightly tied to that thing about money again is the $4.3 billion that they've decided to provide to an American company out of the resources that they stole from your people. But yet they claim they have no money. So I'm optimistic that in spite of the facts, but I don't have any, I don't know, I'm just wondering what your reflections are on those things that don't seem to jive with Canada's claims of reconciliation. Thank you.
Let me just say that our present leader has my respect. He is trying. At least we have a government that is finally willing to at least make an attempt at reconciliation. And it's difficult because it's historical. It's been embedded in Canadian society for the past 150 years, and Canadian society has always had a different view of Indian people, Indigenous people, and I'm hoping that my talk tonight has opened some of your minds, and that we are all willing to understand and make some exceptions and efforts to continue to grow, to learn and understand each other. And I always liken it to the story about the crab pot. It seems that every time that we try to climb out of the pot, that there's another crab pulling us down. And it's probably human nature, but it's something that we need to overcome. Like I said, many people seem to think that we're after special status. At least that's what I read in the last public opinions that were written up in Maclean's magazine about how public opinion is split, and that's worrisome and disheartening for me, because with a country that's split at 50-50, it doesn't take very much to change the winds of direction. And so I'm certainly willing to give the present government some time and some assistance, whatever they need to at least get started on some of the jobs, on making some reparations on some of those wrongs that are so obvious that you can't argue about them, which is why the Supreme Court and the justice system keeps coming down and ruling in favor of the First Nation, because there isn't an argument there. It's all, the wrongs are just so obvious. It's just that we, as a society, have to change our views towards Indigenous people. And we're not enemies of the state. We want to be Canadians also. But we want the respect and the dignity that our grandfathers, that my grandfathers was searching for when they entered into the treaties. It's a very complicated issue, and I hope I've answered most of your questions. Thank you for asking.
Regarding the relationship of the Canadian government to the Indigenous people, I'm strongly reminded of Malcolm X's analogy of being stabbed in the back. He said something like, if you stick a knife 6 inches into my back and then pull it out 2 inches, that's not really progress. It's like you're not even recognizing that the knife is there. You're not, like the knife isn't even out. You haven't even begun to heal the wound. And it seems to me like the victories, so-called, that you mentioned, such as having Indigenous people as senators and in Parliament, and taking down the statue of Cornwallis here, seem like rather hollow victories to me. What are your thoughts on that?
It may seem hollow, but really there's some very major significance to the steps that the city has taken. And I don't consider it hollow. I think it's a very meaningful step in the right direction in displaying at least some sensitivity to our people and its history. And that's why I said that you have my respect and my admiration and gratitude for beginning this process.
And I'm sorry, there's what about Trudeau's recent construction of the pipeline across Indigenous land, and the fact that there are so many reserves that still don't have clean drinking water?
Yes, I'm also ambivalent about pipelines. If they involve our people, and if our people are going to benefit from it, I will support some of the pipelines. But in too many cases, we pursue development for the development itself. Too many corporations are pursuing our natural resources, not for the benefit of the people, but to enrich their shareholders. And it's that type of development that I cast I have a different view of those particular types of developments. So I'm not against development. I am for development, but it has to be rational. We don't need to rush into developing everything that's in the ground right now. We need to save some for our future, for our children and grandchildren. And so, with the Trudeau government spending $4.5 billion or more in buying the pipeline, hopefully he can get a good price for it, because he intends to sell it. And it's politics. We are a nation of 35,000. We do have many people in this world besides the Indigenous people, and there are many issues. And certainly one of them is that we are an advanced country, but somebody needs to pay for it, and so we need to welcome immigration to support a tax base that's required to support our health system, for instance. The universal health programs that we have in this country makes us stand out as one of the best countries in the entire world. But somebody has to pay for it. But we don't need to extract all of our resources and fall over each other, developing everything that we've got. We have lots of resources, and we have lots of time to develop this in a rational manner so that everybody gets to benefit from those developments.
Gerald, welcome. Miigwech. When you just talked about different blind spots existing today from the past, spots how they are developed into today. I question today whether I carry one. And upon presentation tool being requested, asked, in a authorized governing, you want to put white? I didn't put that white there. They call it a status card. And when I'm asked for government ID, it's the only picture ID I have. But it's it's unacceptable in certain locations. Well, today this one has the bear, the eagle, the bison, and the cougar. I have 35 years experience as an EMT. I worked with Canadian Forces. I volunteer a lot. My dad pushed me out. Get out there. Don't let anyone get in your way. I was a bushman. Because I have access to the trap line. I speak my language, and I'm free. A lot of homework. That First Nation. I'm not shy. I can't change it. Coming home, there's a discussion about you're not paying tax. I'm paying tax. Got a new water development line in my place. They're plowing my driveway. Well, that little tax I'm paying, I guess it's paying for it. Look at a 5 million gallon tank, over 1,000 feet away. We all drink the same water. With these blind spots, color of skin, or is it the nature of my status? What is it? Yes, I grew up with both of my parents in residential schools. And I've seen where the part of Canadian, and I spent a lot of time in the woods with a lot of anger growing up. Hearing the fears, all the nightmares, not just from my parents, but from some what their parents gone through. To self, sustain, to find the healing strength. And yes, through my elders, learning from, I went to Winnipeg, I worked there, I felt home. And meeting an elder who helped me maintain the tradition. The last part was a sweat lodge. My language. Just not forget who I am, who you are. I wanted to thank you to help me understand. Sometimes I don't feel like I cannot go home because Dad tells me, stay out there. You have a world that needs you. I don't know what he meant. Was it the question of, it's just always been a question. Well, we got you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this. Just very quickly, when I graduated from high school in Prince Albert, like I said, this was just on the cusp of the migrations into the city. At that time, there were no Aboriginal businesses in Prince Albert. And when I went looking for jobs, I didn't see any. There were no friendly faces. By friendly face, I was looking for a brown face. But there were very few then at that time, for the reasons I told you about. And I did manage to find some odd jobs here and there, but I still struggled. And it was a good year or more. And I remember some of my friends saying, "What's the use?" I said, "Look at you. You got your grade 12 and you're unemployed." And I thought about that for a while too. And then I thought, but at least I have a chance. And so we need, as a people, we need to give ourselves a chance to develop, to heal. And I was ready to give up. I called my dad up in the far north. I said, "Dad, I want to come home." And he said, "Leonard, you're only one of 14 children for one. And for another, I invested in your education. No, you can't come home." He said, "If you come home, I don't want you to become a trapper or a fisherman, and that's all that you would become if you come home. I need you to hold your head up high and make a life for yourself." And it's not an easy world for Indigenous people. And I consider myself lucky. I stumbled onto a job and I did well. And I had something that I could offer to my company and to my president, the president and CEO who took over our company, and he recognized that I had this potential. And that's one of the problems that many of us who are Indigenous people, is that we are so often underestimated for who we are and what we're capable of doing. And so I'm always having to prove myself, even in the simplest things like writing this book. And these are people who worked with me, and they said, "Who was your ghostwriter?" And I said, "I didn't have a ghostwriter. I wrote it myself." They couldn't believe that I had the intelligence and capability to be able to write my own book. I was on one of the boards. It was one of the banking boards, and banking and financial services. The Ombudsman for Banking and Financial Services of Canada. I was on their board for about 4 years, and I ran into some colleagues who said, "Well, I didn't know that they had an Aboriginal branch." And I said, "Well, they don't. It's your money that I'm looking after." So it's funny. I've learned to live with it. We all learned to live with it. And in respect to the treaty card, I have a treaty card in my pocket also, and I've already told several stories to my colleagues who are sponsoring me here. And one of the things that I'm pursuing right now is that we need to have more respect for who we are as a people, and we want respect for the Indigenous card, for our treaty cards. I want to be able to take that card and say, this is my ID, this is who I am, and have it accepted by everyone as an official Canadian document that recognizes who I am, that recognizes all of us for who we are. And I understand your issue, your problem.
Hi, we're just starting to wrap up here. I just noticed the time. It's just been such a lovely discussion. I totally lost track, and I'd love to have Justin come up here and say a little bit before we close out here.
So thank you. My name is Justin Houston. I'm the CEO or Deputy Head for the Provincial Office of Aboriginal Affairs. And I really want to thank you, Len, for what you shared tonight. Very personal, powerful, about our shared history. But not only that, but our shared future together. And I think you gave us some direction and some hope and optimism. So really, on behalf of the audience here and folks online, on behalf of our sponsors, the Segelberg Trust, Government of Nova Scotia, and the Halifax Public Library, which donated the space, I want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you very much.
I'd also like to thank Len. I'm Jesse Hiltz. I'm program coordinator at the center, and because I'm going to just say a couple things, I was thinking if anyone is interested in buying Len's book, why don't you go do that while I'm talking? Because you don't really have to sit and listen to me. And then while you're doing that, I will say what's written on this paper. Just a little housekeeping. Around your chairs, you'll see some event evaluations. Please fill them out and let us know what you thought of the event. And if you leave your email address on the back of your evaluation, we'll be drawing for a copy of Len's book, so you might win a copy. While this presentation closes the 2007 and 18 season, SESEPA has some great events coming up in 2018-19. On September 17th, Bob Ray, the Canada Special Envoy to Myanmar, will be discussing Canada's place in the world and the ongoing situation with the Rohingya, and we're doing that with the McEachern Institute. On January 21st, the Argentinian and Canadian author and translator, and a personal favorite of mine, Alberto Manguel, will be coming to discuss the disappearance of public intellectuals and the erosion of ethical ways of thinking. On February 20th, Dr. Stan Kutcher will be coming to discuss the ethical tensions around suicide and suicide prevention. You can follow SESEPA on social media for more details on those events and other events, and thank you for coming and thank you for sharing.